January 15th, 1991. Kingston, Tennessee. 35-year-old Karen Farmer Beard, who happens to be 7.5 months pregnant, drops off her 2 daughters at the residence of the parents of her ex-husband, Reece Beard. Hours later, Karen's abandoned car is found next to a bridge a quarter-mile away, and while a woman claiming to be Karen phoned a towing service asking them to pick up her car, investigators believe the caller may have been an impostor. Since Karen was engaged in a heated child custody battle with Reece, there is speculation this may have been connected to her disappearance and that multiple people were involved in covering it up, but no trace of Karen is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and today we're going to be covering a pair of unsolved missing persons cases involving pregnant women: the 1991 disappearance of Karen Farmer Beard and the 1987 disappearance of Shelly Hansen. Ironically enough, about 3 years ago, I received separate emails requesting that I cover each of these cases only 2 days apart, and even though they are not believed to be connected to each other, they do have a number of similarities, so I thought it would be appropriate to cover both of them on this episode. While both victims were pregnant at the time they went missing, they were not involved in relationships, and it was never conclusively confirmed who their unborn child's father was. And another similarity is that each of these crimes took place in small towns, and the victim's car was found abandoned. At the time she disappeared, Karen Farmer Beard was in the midst of a heated child custody dispute with her ex-husband, Reece Beard, and after Karen dropped her 2 children off at the home of Reece's parents, she vanished without a trace before her abandoned car was found a quarter-mile away. What was particularly odd is that on the night Karen went missing, a local towing service received a call from a woman claiming to be Karen, who told them that she had lost her car keys and needed a tow. But when a recording of Karen's voice was played for the employee who took the call, he became certain that Karen was not the person he spoke to. This has led to speculation that Karen's disappearance was the result of an organized conspiracy involving multiple people, and at one point, it sounds like a potential suspect was ready to give a deathbed confession to police, but passed away before he got the opportunity. And what further complicates this story is that Karen told her family that Reece was the father of their child, but he always denied this. In Shelly Hansen's case, when she told her family about her pregnancy, she informed them that she was willing to raise her child as a single mother, but the father would provide financial support as long as she kept his identity a secret. But much like Karen, Shelly would soon vanish without a trace, and her abandoned car was found in the parking lot of a resort. Another unique aspect to this story is that 1 year after Shelly went missing, a local resident named John Weber was arrested for the brutal torture and murder of his sister-in-law, as well as the torture and attempted murder of his wife. Since this was not an area which was known for violent crime, the timing of these events has created speculation that the 2 cases might be linked, but thus far, no evidence has ever been found to indicate that Weber was involved in Shelly's disappearance. So on this episode, I'm going to share the details about Karen's story before I provide my theories and analysis, and then I'm going to do the same thing with Shelly's case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. as our Patreon page has over 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Karen Farmer Beard. Our story begins in Roane County, Tennessee in 1991, and our central figure is 35-year-old Karen Farmer Beard. Karen currently lives in an apartment in the town of Harriman and is the mother of 2 daughters aged 8 and 5, and she also happens to be 7.5 months pregnant. In 1985, Karen was living in San Diego, California with her husband, Reece Beard, but after many years of having a tumultuous on-again, off-again relationship, the couple officially separated only 2 months after their youngest daughter was born. At that point, Karen was using drugs like cocaine and amphetamine and had to be hospitalized because of her addiction issues. 2 years later, Reece won custody of their 2 daughters by default when Karen failed to appear at a hearing, though she would always insist that this was done by quote-unquote subterfuge and his custody was obtained fraudulently. Karen and Reece got divorced, and on the same day it was officially finalized, Reece married Karen's former best friend, Cindy, and they would soon relocate to Roane County with the 2 girls. Well, Karen eventually overcame her drug issues, and after she got clean, she vowed to become a parent again, and also decided to relocate to Roane County to get a fresh start and be closer to her children. For the past 3 years, Karen and Reece have been engaged in a bitter child custody dispute. Karen has alleged that Reece was an habitual drug and alcohol user who also sold drugs and constantly had affairs with other women, whereas Reece has accused Karen of similar indiscretions. Karen's sister, Linda Farmer, lives in San Diego, and after Karen became pregnant, she told Linda that Reece was the father of her unborn child, though he has always denied this. Regardless, Karen believes that she has a good chance of regaining custody of her 2 daughters, but for the moment, she has visitation rights. At around 4 p.m. on January the 15th, Karen picked up her daughters at Calvary Baptist School in the town of Kingston, which is where Reece and his family live and is located just over 6 miles from Harriman. After spending the next few hours with the girls, Karen dropped them off with her stepmother Cindy at the home of Reece's parents, Dr. Craig Beard and Dr. Carolyn Beard. The Beards were one of the most prominent families in the area, as Craig was a dentist, while Carolyn was a physician who ran the Roane County Health Department. The story goes that after dropping off her daughters, Karen left the Beard residence at around 7:30 p.m. in order to drive back to Harriman, but this would turn out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive. At the time, Karen was employed as a waitress at Shoney's restaurant in Lewinar City, located about 25 miles outside of Harriman. Her next shift was scheduled to start at 10 a.m. on January the 16th, but she failed to show up. She also did not contact anyone, and when Karen's co-workers tried to phone her at her apartment, there was no answer. When Karen failed to resurface by the following day, her co-workers contacted the Harriman Police Department and asked them to check her apartment, but when they went there was no answers to repeated knocks on the front door. It does not sound like anyone heard from Karen at all over the course of the next week, but concern really grew on January the 23rd, when Karen failed to show up for a scheduled appointment with her lawyer, Brenda Hall, as they were planning to discuss her child custody dispute. When Hall learned that Karen had not been seen in over a week, she contacted the Roane County Sheriff's Office in Kingston in order to officially report Karen missing. Deputies from the Sheriff's Office joined Hall at Karen's apartment, but found no signs of struggle or forced entry. Even though Karen's car was not parked outside, her purse, wallet, car keys, and the rest of her personal belongings were still inside the apartment. The Sheriff's Office soon learned that Karen had last been seen at the residence of Craig and Carolyn Beard, and when they were questioned, they maintained that they last saw Karen when she drove away after dropping off her daughters at 7:30 p.m. on January the 15th. However, on that particular night, Reece Beard happened to be at the residence of a woman he knew in Harriman, and he claimed that at around 8:30 p.m. he received a phone call from Karen, who told him that she had stopped at a pull-off near the Center Ferry Bridge, which crosses over the Clinch River. this particular spot was only about a quarter mile from Reece's parents' residence, but Karen told him that she had lost her car keys and asked Reece if he could come help her move her vehicle. Reece said that he drove to the location with a trailer and was planning to load Karen's car onto it, but since the steering wheel was locked and they didn't have any keys, there was nothing they could do, so he advised Karen to call a tow truck. Well, even though an acquaintance of Reece corroborated his story, investigators still felt that there were some odd discrepancies, as they weren't sure how Karen could have known that Reece was at this woman's home in Harriman. In addition, the woman's phone number was unlisted, and as far as anyone could tell, there didn't seem to be any reason for Karen to have it, and Reece also said that he didn't know where Karen made the phone call from. Things got even weirder when investigators learned that a towing company called Collier Wrecker Service received a phone call from a woman claiming to be Karen Farmer Beard at around 10 p.m. on the evening of January the 15th, which would have been shortly after her alleged encounter with Reece. The caller said that she needed a tow truck for her car and provided directions to the pull-off next to the Center Ferry Bridge. It sounds like it took the towing company a few hours to respond to the request, as a tow truck driver arrived at the scene at around 2 a.m. on January the 16th, but while Karen's car was there and presumably got towed away, Karen herself was nowhere to be found. But it turned out that a few hours earlier, shortly after midnight, Brent Hamby, a deputy with the Roane County Sheriff's Office, had driven by this spot and recalled seeing the car parked there, though there appeared to be no one else around. When Deputy Hamby drove by this location again at around 5 a.m., the car was no longer there. Since investigators were suspicious of the whole situation, they played a recording of Karen's voice to the employee from Collier Wrecker Service who had supposedly spoken with her on the phone. Since Karen had spent most of her life living in California and had a distinct accent from the region, the employee felt that the woman who called him had a completely different sounding voice. The Roane County Rescue Squad performed an extensive search of the Clinch River near the Center Ferry Bridge, but were unable to find Karen or any evidence related to her disappearance. Investigators started looking into the custody dispute between Karen and Reece and learned that 3 months earlier, in October of 1990, a motion was filed which allowed their two daughters to privately speak with the judge in his chambers to let them know which parent they preferred to live with. This motion was accompanied by affidavits filed on the girls' behalf, in which they each said that they wanted to live with their mother. For this reason, Karen was confident that she would regain full custody of them, but things reportedly got so heated that she accused Reece of attempting to send some of his friends to rough her up, and when they couldn't find her, they wound up slashing her tires and damaging her car instead. Karen's attorney, Brenda Hall, would describe her client as being, quote-unquote, mortally afraid of her ex-husband, and while Karen's sister Linda said that Karen was still in love with Reece, she had also come to terms with the fact that a relationship with him would never work. Linda also said that Karen asked her if she would sign papers to become the legal guardian of her unborn child if anything ever happened to her. For their part, the Beard family denied any knowledge or involvement in Karen's disappearance. While Reece declined to speak with the media, his mother, Carolyn, spoke on his behalf and denied the allegations of her son being a drug and alcohol abuser, claiming that Karen made up these stories to get back at him and mask her own past issues with drugs. Carolyn described Karen as being, quote-unquote, unstable, and expressed her belief that she disappeared voluntarily and would eventually turn up, stating, quote, she's done this before. One time she was gone for 11 months, another time for 3 months, and a third time for a week, end quote. Indeed, Karen did have a prior history of running away, as she decided to take off from San Diego when she was 9 months pregnant with her first child, who wound up being born while Karen was in Reno, Nevada. However, given that Karen had been fighting so diligently to regain custody of her daughters, Brenda Hall did not believe that her client took off and told the press, quote, I think she has been killed. The circumstances are not those of someone who has run away, end quote. Karen's projected due date for her third child was March the 10th, but after that date passed, no records could be found of her having given birth anywhere. For her part, Carolyn claimed that neither she nor her husband even knew that Karen was pregnant when she disappeared, and when they asked Reece about it, he continued to deny being the child's father. The case pretty much faded out of the spotlight for 2 decades, but in November of 2010, an article was published about it in the Knoxville News-Sentinel in which Clarence Robbins, a former investigator from the 9th Judicial District Attorney General's Office, described Karen's disappearance as one of the most frustrating cases of his career. Based on information that he obtained during the investigation, Robbins expressed his belief that Karen was taken to a house in Kingston and murdered before her body was disposed of. Additional comments were provided for the article by Daryl Sermons and Dennis Ledbetter, 2 retired detectives with the Roane County Sheriff's Office, and they and Robbins all believed that more than one person was involved in Karen's disappearance, and several other people withheld key information about the case. They also wondered if someone in law enforcement was involved in the cover-up and helped sabotage the investigation. Sermons stated, quote, "I always had a feeling that some people in the family, and in law enforcement too, knew more than they told us. There was just too much cat and mouse going on. When we would go to talk to some people, they pass us off to someone else." End quote. Sermons and Ledbetter would not name the individual from law enforcement whom they suspected of hampering the investigation, but did confirm that he was deceased at that point. Robbins also confirmed that law enforcement had 3 strong suspects, and he also believed that several acquaintances of Reece, who were described as being quote-unquote rough and unsavory, likely had information about Karen's disappearance which they refused to disclose. At one point, one of the unnamed suspects was dying of cancer at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, and Robbins received word that he had something he wanted to say. But by the time Robbins arrived at the medical center to speak with this man, he had slipped into a coma and would die the following day. According to the article, Reece had since moved out of Roane County and was living in Overton County at that point, but he declined the request for comment. They also reported that the Roane County Sheriff's Office had recently hired a cold case investigator to work the case, but since this is the last time I've seen this story get any media coverage, I'm presuming this hasn't led anywhere. So after 35 years, Karen Farmer Beard continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So this is a very frustrating case in which we have a pregnant woman going missing and a lot of potentially scandalous details, including allegations of a conspiracy involving several people and corruption from law enforcement, yet there seems to be very little information out there about this story and virtually no media coverage outside of Tennessee. I definitely have a lot of unanswered questions, and I find it jarring that no less than 3 retired investigators were willing to go on the record and allege that someone from law enforcement attempted to sandbag their efforts and prevent the crime from being solved. There are a number of red flags surrounding Karen Farmer Beard's disappearance, and one individual who certainly had a strong motive to make her disappear, but how many people would have been willing to involve themselves in this whole situation? The story goes that Karen and her ex-husband, Reece Beard, had a pretty tumultuous relationship when they were married, and while I don't know the full story, it sounds like Karen was not completely blameless since she had a history of drug issues. Both sides constantly accused the other of doing horrible things, but it sounds like Karen did manage to get clean and was turning her life around at the time she went missing, and even though Reece had custody of their 2 daughters, it sounds like they both would have preferred to live with their mother, which is why Karen thought there was a good chance that she would get them back. Even though Reece got remarried, Karen claimed that he was the father of her unborn child, though he has always denied this. Since no paternity test ever took place, we'll probably never know the full truth, but according to Karen's sister Linda, even though Karen had come to terms with the fact that she and Reece had no long-term future, she apparently still had feelings for him. So theoretically, I could see a situation unfolding in which they attempted some sort of reconciliation which led to them having sex and her becoming pregnant. Of course, if Reece's paternity was proven, this wouldn't bode too well for his child custody battle that he was cheating on his wife and secretly having sex with a woman whom he was trying to paint as an unfit mother. In other words, it definitely would have been in Reece's best interest for Karen to disappear before her child was born. During his interview in the Knoxville News-Sentinel article in 2010, former investigator Clarence Robbins confirmed that they had narrowed down the field to 3 strong suspects, though their identities were not disclosed, and it's never been confirmed if any of the suspects was Reece. All of the retired investigators who were interviewed in this article believe that multiple people were either directly involved in what happened to Karen or intentionally withheld key information, though they never went so far as to directly accuse anyone. I know that Reece hailed from a fairly prominent family in the area, as his father Craig was a dentist and his mother Carolyn was a physician, and I'll definitely stop short of accusing his family of being involved in Karen's disappearance. But the fact of the matter is that Karen was last confirmed to be alive when she dropped off her 2 daughters with her stepmother Cindy at Craig and Carolyn's residence. I've never seen Karen's daughters publicly comment on this case, so I have no idea how they view the whole situation, but given that Karen's abandoned car was found only a quarter mile away from the Beard residence, I'd be curious to know if there were any independent eyewitnesses who could verify having seen Karen drive away that night, or if we only have the Beard's word that this happened. Craig and Carolyn have both since passed away, but at the time, Carolyn did not hesitate to become the family spokesperson with the media as she defended her son and attempted to paint Karen in the most negative possible light. Karen even attempted to push forward the possibility that Karen ran away voluntarily, but given that there has never been any trace of Karen at all these past 35 years, or any record of her having given birth, the chances of this are pretty much non-existent. If Reece was responsible for what happened, it sounds like he knew enough unsavory characters at that time who may have been willing to help him cover up a murder without the involvement of his own family. We know that someone claiming to be Karen phoned Collier Wrecking Service that night asking for her car to be towed, but since the employee who spoke with her became convinced that it was not Karen's voice he heard, this suggests that at the very least, a woman had attempted to impersonate her and was complicit in what happened. But let's look at the timeline from the night Karen went missing. The official story provided by Reece is that at around 8:30 p.m., about an hour after Karen left his parents' house, he received a phone call from her to inform him that she had lost her keys and needed her car to be moved from a pull-off near the Center Ferry Bridge at the Clinch River, a spot which was about a quarter mile from the Beard residence. Reece then said that he drove to this location and attempted to load the car onto a trailer, but was unable to do so since the steering wheel was locked. Well, I already outlined some of the issues that law enforcement had with this story, and there are definitely a ton of red flags. For starters, I'm not sure if Reece ever asked Karen for an explanation about why she would have decided to pull over next to the bridge to begin with, and what led to her getting out of her vehicle and losing her keys. According to investigators, Reece claimed that Karen never told him where she was calling from, and you have to remember that we're talking about the prehistoric world of 1991 before everyone had cell phones. If Karen did call Reece, she would have needed to walk to a nearby payphone, and I'm not sure how many of those were in the area, or she would have had to ask someone from a local residence or a business if she could use their phone, and as far as I can tell, no one ever came forward to report Karen having done that. Of course, the biggest issue with Reece's story is that he claimed Karen phoned him while he was at another woman's residence in Harriman, but how could Karen have even known he would be there to begin with? Even if by chance Reece's family told Karen he was there that night, I don't get the impression that Karen knew this woman, and since her phone number was unlisted, where did Karen obtain it? In most cases, these discrepancies may have pushed Reece to the very top of the suspect list, but an acquaintance of his did apparently back up his story. But, as we're going to discuss, investigators have always suspected that several people may have been complicit in Karen's disappearance, so how can we be certain that Reece's acquaintance didn't provide him with a false alibi? Now, if Reece is lying, then you might be wondering why he would bother to fabricate a story like this and place himself at the scene. Well, there doesn't seem to be any logical reason for Karen to pull over at that particular spot, which makes me wonder if her car was driven or transported there from another location. If Reece did that, and some witnesses happened to pass by and see him near the bridge with Karen's car, he would already have a ready-made cover story to provide to law enforcement to explain why he was there. Reece claimed that since he couldn't move the car with his trailer, he advised her to call a tow truck, and sure enough, the supposed call from Karen to call your wrecking service took place at 10 p.m. But once again, it's never been confirmed where exactly Karen was supposed to have been calling from, as I have no idea if there were any payphones in the area, so this is just one more reason to suspect that it might have been another woman impersonating Karen. What's also strange is that we have the account from the sheriff's deputy, Brent Hamby, who claimed that he drove by the car at around midnight, 2 hours before the tow truck arrived, but he did not recall seeing anyone there. If Karen did legitimately make that call to the wrecking service, I suppose an alternate explanation is that someone could have come across her while she was waiting alone by her car and either forcibly abducted her or offered her a ride, which is why she was gone by the time Hamby passed by. But on the other hand, perhaps the main reason someone staged the scene by planting the car at that location is because they were hoping to make people believe that Karen was abducted and murdered by a random stranger who stumbled upon her there. Another detail about this case which makes no sense to me is that Karen's purse, wallet, and car keys were found inside her apartment, and I have to wonder if perhaps that detail might have been misreported. If the keys were there, then this would obviously go against the narrative that Karen lost them, but at the same time, if someone killed her, I'm not sure why the perpetrator would go to the trouble of returning the keys and those other items to her apartment. This does make me wonder if Karen actually did manage to drive from Kingston back to her apartment in Harriman before she crossed paths with her killer. They then took the car to the Center Ferry Bridge in order to stage the scene, but of course, I'm not sure how they would have done that without her keys, unless they transported the vehicle there using a trailer or something. Looking back through the newspaper archives, the earliest coverage in the Knoxville News-Sentinel almost made it look like this could blow up into a major case, yet it inexplicably seemed to disappear from the spotlight for 2 decades until they wrote a new article in 2010 in which no less than 3 retired investigators shared their thoughts and expressed their frustration at the obstacles they faced at trying to solve this. The details were pretty vague, but they alleged that another law enforcement figure who was deceased by that point may have orchestrated a cover-up, and they believe that Karen was taken to a house somewhere in Kingston before she was murdered. Without knowing any more specifics, I can't really offer too many more thoughts, but based on the evidence which has been released publicly, I do think that something happened to Karen shortly after she dropped off her daughters at the Beard residence, and her murder likely took place sometime between 7:30 and 10 p.m., because that's when the woman who was likely an impostor called for the tow truck. This indicates that Karen's car had been abandoned near the bridge by that point, and the plan for a cover-up had been set in motion, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how things got from point A to point B. I do agree that multiple people had to have been involved in Karen's disappearance, and while you might be wondering how they've all managed to keep their mouths shut for 35 years, it sounds like we came very close to a deathbed confession at one point, but the suspect lapsed into a coma and died of cancer before he could say anything. The retired investigators claimed that they narrowed things down to 3 suspects, one of whom was the man who passed away, but from their wording, it's not clear if they consider them to be 3 separate suspects or 3 suspects who work together. For instance, if they consider Reece Beard to be one of the suspects, are the other 2 individuals alternate suspects or conspirators who helped them cover up the crime? Given how little evidence there seems to be in this case, it's possible that it won't be broken wide open until someone decides to talk and clear their conscience. All we know for certain is that Karen has been missing for 35 years, and since she was pregnant, and it seems unlikely that her child was ever born, there were technically 2 victims in this case. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Karen Farmer Beard, please contact the Roane County Sheriff's Office at 865-717-4700. That's 865-717-4700. And now let's move on to our next case. Our second story begins in 1987 in Phillips, Wisconsin, a small town located in Price County which had a population of just over 1,500 at that time and is surrounded by wooded areas. Our central figure is 23-year-old Marchelle Hansen, who goes by the name Shelly. Shelly grew up nearly 250 miles away in the town of Random Lake, Wisconsin, and was the youngest of 6 children, but after her parents divorced, she elected to move to the town of Hawkins with her mother Joyce when she was 10 years old. Following her graduation from high school, Shelly worked numerous factory jobs before she relocated to Phillips, and she currently lives by herself in an apartment. She holds down 2 part-time jobs, one of them as a factory laborer for Marquip Incorporated, a manufacturing firm which produces corrugated paperboard, and the other job is at an IGA grocery store. Sometime in early November, Shelly phoned her mother Joyce and one of her brothers Robert to inform them that she was about 2 to 3 months pregnant. She would not reveal who the father of the child was, and it does not sound like she was in a relationship with him, but Shelly was still excited to be pregnant and had even started picking out names and looking at baby furniture. Joyce would later say that Shelly didn't even consider the possibility of an abortion, stating, quote, "She was going to raise the child by herself. She wanted that child and she was happy," end quote. Shelly also said that the father was willing to provide her with financial support as long as she kept his identity a secret. On November the 12th, Shelly went to a local clinic for an ultrasound and received a fetal sonogram of her unborn child. Since Shelly wore a brace to correct a congenital foot deformity, she wanted to undergo the ultrasound to see if her baby would have the same deformity. After the appointment, Shelly went to the Marquip factory to work her next scheduled shift and showed the sonogram to many of her coworkers. At around 8 p.m., Shelly completed her shift and drove away from the factory in her car, but this would turn out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive. Shelly was next scheduled to work a shift at her second job at the IGA grocery store, but she did not show up and made no attempt to contact anyone. When Shelly failed to resurface for the next 4 days, one of her coworkers at the IGA finally reported her missing to the Price County Sheriff's Office on November the 17th. Later that day, Shelly's abandoned car was discovered in the parking lot of the Lake 10 Resort, located 11 miles south of Phillips. The location consisted of a tavern and a number of cabins, and while Shelly had apparently visited this tavern in the past, she was not a regular there, and it does not sound like anyone from the resort recalled seeing her around the time she went missing. There were no signs of foul play in Shelly's vehicle, but even though several searches were performed of the surrounding area, which included divers checking Lake 10, nothing could be found. The police also performed a search of Shelly's apartment and gave a number of personal belongings to one of her brothers, Ron Hansen, who lived in the town of Park Falls. But curiously, one item which could not be found inside the apartment or Shelly's car and has never been recovered was the sonogram of her unborn child. 2 days after Ron received his sister's belongings, a fire broke out at his residence, which wound up destroying them. When the blaze was investigated by fire inspectors, they concluded that it had been started by an overheated wood-burning stove and found nothing to indicate it was anything more than an accident. Even though Shelly maintained a close relationship with Ron and frequently spoke with him, his wife Wendy insisted that no one from the family had any idea who the father of Shelly's child might be. Wendy told the press, quote, "Except for the family, Shelly pretty much stayed to herself. There wasn't anyone she was really close to in Phillips. Shelly was quiet and pretty easygoing," end quote. Well, it turned out that at the time Shelly disappeared, the Price County Sheriff's Office was investigating another unsolved missing persons case involving a young woman. The victim in question was 17-year-old Carla Lenz, a student from Phillips High School who lived in the nearby town of Worcester, and she vanished after leaving her home on November the 12th, 1986, exactly 1 year to the day before Shelly went missing. Naturally, the authorities explored the possibility that there might be a connection between the two cases. Well, in September of 1988, Carla's 21-year-old sister, Emily Lenz Weber, was brought to a local hospital by her 24-year-old husband, John Weber, and placed in the intensive care unit. She had been sexually assaulted and was suffering from severe injuries, and John told the Price County Sheriff's Office that she had been attacked, assaulted, and tortured by a trio of unidentified strangers. When investigators went to the intensive care unit to question Emily, she initially shared the same story until she broke down and told them that her injuries had actually been inflicted by her own husband. According to Emily, John had asked her to take a ride with him because he had a quote-unquote surprise for her, and they drove to his parents' vacant farm property. After they arrived, John pulled out a knife and held it against Emily's throat before he proceeded to spend the next several hours brutally torturing and sexually assaulting her. The following morning, John drove Emily home, but realized that she would need medical treatment at the hospital for her injuries, so he ordered her to share a fabricated cover story about being assaulted by 3 strangers. But when Emily was questioned by law enforcement, she admitted that she had been assaulted and tortured by her own husband, so John was placed under arrest. When John's car was searched for evidence, they uncovered an audio tape containing a recording in which John described torturing and assaulting Emily's sister, Carla Lenz, in a very similar fashion before he killed her by stepping on her throat while she was unconscious. Police soon confronted John with this recording, and he admitted that he murdered Carla and led them to a shallow grave containing her remains. John would later agree to plead guilty to the charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping, and he was also convicted on 7 counts of first-degree sexual assault, 1 count of false imprisonment, and 1 count of mayhem with use of a dangerous weapon. When Emily recovered from her injuries, she testified against her husband at a preliminary hearing, and John eventually pled guilty to the additional charges of attempted murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, battery, and 3 counts of first-degree assault. He wound up receiving a sentence of life imprisonment plus 164 years and 9 months, and was sent to the Green Bay Correctional Institution. Since the shallow grave containing Carla's remains happened to be located only 4 miles from Shelly Hansen's apartment, investigators started looking at John as a potential suspect in Shelly's disappearance, though his attorney initially advised him not to discuss anything. However, it's been reported that John has since been interviewed numerous times about Shelly's case in prison and denied any involvement, and while he is considered to be a person of interest, there is not enough evidence to formally label him as a suspect. In January of 2024, Shelly's case was featured on an episode of the Forgotten Wisconsin Cold Cases podcast, which is produced by WSAW, a TV station in Wausau, and it featured an interview with current Price County Sheriff Brian Schmidt. He confirmed that his office was considering the possibility of resubmitting physical evidence which had been collected to the crime lab, though he would not publicly confirm if they had any DNA. So at the moment, the case is still at a standstill, and after more than 38 years, Shelly Hansen continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So much like the Karen Farmer Beard case, there is a frustrating lack of information available about the disappearance of Shelly Hansen, as it doesn't seem to have gotten much media coverage outside of Wisconsin, even though it involves a pregnant woman going missing. However, the horrific story of John Weber, Emily Lenz Weber, and Carla Lenz has gotten a bit more attention, as a book was written about that case, and it was featured on an episode of the popular true crime podcast Small Town Murder, which briefly mentioned Shelly's disappearance, but did not offer any new information about it. I have to confess that I elected not to share the graphic, explicit details of John Weber's assault and torture of his wife and sister-in-law, because even though I'm a lifelong true crime follower who has seen it all, some of the things that he did to those poor women made my stomach churn. Of course, when Weber was charged with these crimes and the investigation started looking at a potential connection with Shelly's case, the Hansen family flat out said that they really hoped she was not murdered by Weber and had to undergo the same ordeal that Emily and Carla did. Following Weber's arrest, his attorneys advised him not to speak to the authorities about Shelly's case, but since he ultimately pled guilty to his other crimes and received a sentence of life imprisonment, it sounds like investigators have had the opportunity to interview him in prison about Shelly a few times. It does not sound like Weber has shared anything of value, and while the authorities still consider him to be a person of interest, there is not enough evidence to classify him as a suspect. If Weber did in fact kill her, you would hope that he would just come clean and confess, since he's going to be in prison for the rest of his life anyway, but convicted murderers are narcissistic enough that even when they have nothing left to lose, they will often refuse to admit to other crimes they committed because they get off on having that power. Now, even though there does not appear to be any direct evidence of Weber's involvement, I can definitely see compelling arguments both for and against him being responsible for Shelly's disappearance. On one hand, Carla Lenz went missing exactly 1 year to the day before Shelly did, which seems like quite a coincidence, and given that she was buried in a shallow grave just 4 miles from Shelly's apartment, and Phillips is a small town in the middle of nowhere which is surrounded by woods, what are the odds that 2 different murderers would be operating in the same area who would kill different women 1 year apart? But on the other hand, given that Shelly had gotten pregnant and was going out of her way not to disclose the identity of the child's father, it's definitely logical to believe that this man would be the prime suspect and decided to kill Shelly in order to prevent his secret from coming out. Sadly, homicide has always been the leading cause of death for pregnant women in the United States, as historically, there is a higher statistical likelihood of them being murdered rather than dying from medical issues. When I heard that Shelly had told her family that the father of her baby was going to provide financial support on the condition that she kept his identity a secret, alarm bells started going off in my head. I immediately got the feeling that this guy was already married and possibly had other children of his own, and feared that a major scandal would ensue if word got out that he had gotten another woman pregnant. Sadly, this is far from the only case I've covered on The Trail Went Cold where a pregnant woman went missing under these exact circumstances. Given that Phillips is a small town and it's often hard to keep secrets in places like that, it is a bit surprising that no information has come out about who the child's father might have been. I'm sure there have probably been rumors and gossip about this, but law enforcement has never indicated that they have any strong candidates. But if the father did kill Shelly for the purposes of keeping their secret under wraps, then they may have technically achieved their goal. All that being said, these 2 different theories about John Weber and the covering up of Shelly's pregnancy would not cancel each other out if it turned out that Weber was actually the father. He was married at the time and would have every reason to cover something like this up, but Weber was also a guy who liked torturing and killing women for his own sadistic pleasure. So if he did kill Shelly, it's possible that he may not have even known her and selected her completely at random to be a victim, and her being pregnant had nothing to do with it. But let's assume that Shelly was murdered by her child's father. According to her family, Shelly was a very quiet young woman who did not have much of a social life and mostly kept to herself, which is probably why no one seems to know who the father might have been. It sounds like there was nothing in Shelly's personal belongings to shed any light on the father's identity, and I know it might sound suspicious that many of these belongings wound up being destroyed in a fire right after they were given to her brother Ron. But from what I can tell, the authorities believe the fire was nothing more than an unfortunate, coincidental accident, so I have no reason to believe that Ron was involved in his sister's disappearance and was destroying evidence to cover it up. If the father of her child was married to someone else, Shelly may not have even known until after she became pregnant, and he then offered the ultimatum to provide financial support as long as she kept his identity a secret. I find the timing of Shelly's disappearance to be interesting, as she vanished right after working a shift at the Marquip factory, but earlier that day she had gotten a sonogram of her baby and reportedly showed it to her coworkers. Since the sonogram was never found, it makes me wonder if the father may have also worked at Marquip and became very paranoid when she saw Shelly talking so openly about her pregnancy, which is why he decided to get rid of her in order to prevent the truth about his paternity from coming out. Shelly's abandoned car was found in the parking lot of the Lake 10 Resort, which consisted of a tavern and some cabins, and even though Shelly was not known for being a regular, she had apparently been there before. Since no one recalled seeing Shelly at the resort around the time of her disappearance, we cannot know for certain if she was the one who drove her car there, but I have to wonder if Shelly possibly had some previous romantic getaways at this location with her child's father. In fact, the guy could have conceivably set Shelly up by luring her to the resort for another meetup, but then he wound up getting rid of her instead. Perhaps another reason that no one has figured out the father's identity is that he did not actually live in Phillips, but hailed from another town and would sometimes meet up with Shelly for secret rendezvous at the Lake 10 Resort. Whatever the case, I'd say the chances of Shelly having run away voluntarily are pretty much zero, as she and her child were definitely the victims of a homicide. So I guess the big question is, could John Weber have been involved in Shelly's disappearance? Or is the timing of these two separate crimes taking place in the same town exactly 1 year apart nothing more than a coincidence? Once again, I do think that the most logical explanation is that Shelly was harmed by her child's father, but if that person happened to be Weber, then the pieces of the puzzle would fit together perfectly. I know that the current investigators were planning to retest some pieces of physical evidence, and while they have not confirmed or denied if they have DNA, I'm sure that as a convicted murderer, Weber's DNA would be in the system, and if it was somehow linked to evidence from Shelly's case, that would be very compelling. But until we learn any new information, all we can really do is speculate. So if you happen to have any information on the disappearance of Shelly Hansen, please contact the Price County Sheriff's Office at 715-339-3011. That's 715-339-3011. However, if you have your own thoughts about what happened in either of today's featured cases, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7.5 years, our Patreon page has released over 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released an episode about the 1988 murders of the Jordan children, which involved 5 members of the same family being killed when their house was set on fire and no one was ever brought to justice for the crime. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discussed the 2008 disappearance of Brandon Swanson. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Stephen H., Shannon C., Amy M., and Dave J. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.